The film opens with an episode of the popular 1977 game show To Tell the Truth. In this episode, three contestants pose to panelists as the legendary Frank William Abagnale, pilot, lawyer, and personification of many things, a doctor who has cheated millions of dollars on 3 continents, all before he turned 19. Asked who got him, Frank reveals the name of Carl Hanratty. The film then shifts to 1969, where FBI agent Carl Hanratty arrives at a French prison and a flu-stricken Frank Abagnale Jr. tries to escape from prison but is too sick to even come out. Hand over the Frank surrenders and asks Carl to take him home. The movie then flashes back 6 years. 16-year-old Frank Abagnale Jr. lives in New Rochelle, New York with his father Frank Abagnale Sr. and French mother Paula. Frank adores his father and is so proud of him that he became the Rotary Club of New Rochelle's Wall of Honor for life. One morning, Frank's father wakes him up from his bed and takes him to the store while Frank watches as his father gets a woman to lend him a black suit for Frank Jr., dressed in the Chase Manhattan Bank. He pretended to be a chauffeur to impress the bankers and secure a loan. When the loan is denied, the family is forced to move from a large house to a smaller apartment, creating tension between Frank's parents. Frank then enrolls in public school and shows up in his former uniform on his first day. When he overhears some boys in his class making fun of his uniform as he walks into class, Frank walks to the front of the class and pretends to be the new class's substitute teacher, claiming he made a mistake, kept the substitute teachers away. The ruse lasts a week until Frank is discovered and his parents are called to discuss the matter. His mother is upset about this, but Frank's father is very impressed with how far his son has come over his dizziness. Frank comes home from school one day to find his mother having an affair with his father's friend, Jack Burns. His mother tries to buy his silence, but Frank is too upset to care. Shortly thereafter, Frank returns home to find that his parents are divorced. When asked which parents he wants to be with, Frank runs away from home and uses his checkbook to head for transportation and residence. Soon running out of money, Frank attempts to create a fake check from his checkbook and commits credit fraud with the banker, with little success. One day he finds some airline pilots and some stewardesses checking into a hotel. It inspires Frank to see them get his VIP treatment everywhere. He learns more about the airline by sneaking into a Pan Am pilot's uniform, pretending to be a college student, writing a report on Pan Am, and interviewing one of its executives and former pilots. Frank then uses his uniform and knowledge to create fake Pan Am checks, which he successfully cashes in banks and hotels across New York. The scam works so that even the bank manager who was refusing him gets caught up in the ruse. Frank attempts to carry out the same check fraud at the airport, but is mistaken for a dead pilot who is expected to fly to Miami. Frank rolls it around and experiences his first flight, followed by his first sexual experience with one of the flight attendants. In Miami, Frank learns valuable information about check forwarding after having an open affair with one of the bankers. He then buys his check coding machine at an auction and uses it to go ahead with his plans and create larger checks. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty, a persistent FBI agent with little humor, discovers Frank's check fraud and tracks the latest fake check to his hotel. To his surprise, Carl finds Frank still staying there and breaks into his room to arrest him. Knowing only that Carl is in the FBI, Frank emerges from the bathroom in his suit. Frank pretends to be a U.S. secret agent in his service, Barry Allen, and brazenly claims that he caught the suspect before Carl showed up. It is after Frank flees the room that Carl realizes he has been tricked. After the encounter, the room information and Carl's description yield no clues, and the fingerprints collected in the room lead nowhere. In another interview with a Pan Am executive, we learn that Frank has amassed several nicknames, including Skywayman and James Bond in the Sky, buys a Bond-style suit and an Aston Martin car and takes it for a test drive. Shortly thereafter, he meets a magazine model named Cheryl Ann at the hotel where he is staying. She offers to stay with him for $1,000, but Frank claims he only has a check for $1,400. Pay the remaining $400 in cash due. As a result, the girl is actually paying Frank to sleep with her. Frank soon tries to find a way to reunite his divorced parents using the stolen money. He invites his father to a fancy restaurant and gives him the keys to a brand new Cadillac. Frank Sr. explains that because the IRS is still watching him, he cannot receive the gift and Paula refuses to speak to him. A few months later, on Christmas Eve, with Carl working alone in the FBI office, Frank calls to apologize for setting him up at the hotel. Carl does not accept the apology and demands to see Frank in person. Frank gives Carl his location and room number, but Carl doesn't believe him. As the conversation continued, Carl soon realized the reason for the call. Frank has no one else to talk to. Frank hangs up angrily and Carl continues his investigation with renewed vigor. Carl later discovers that the name Barry Allen is a character in the Flash comics and suspects Frank may be underage. Carl remembers Frank mentioning the New York Yankees on the phone and has his men scout the New York area for runaways. Her search eventually leads her to Frank's mother. Her mother is now remarried to Jack Burns. When Carl sees Frank's yearbook photo, he immediately recognizes him and eventually learns who his suspect is, reveals that he has already stolen approximately $1.3 million. Sometime later, while visiting a friend at an Atlanta hospital, Frank meets and takes an interest in a young hospital nurse named Brenda Strong. He decides to enter the hospital by posing as a doctor with a fake Harvard Medical School diploma and an impressive fake resume. He is hired as the ERS night manager and makes sure Brenda is on staff. Despite his lack of medical knowledge or experience, Frank is able to self-report and make medical calls to the team's medical intern so the administrative aspects can be handled without touching the patient. Ultimately, he wins over Brenda and the two fall in love. After learning that her parents disowned her when she had an abortion in the past, Frank tries to help her reconcile with her family by proposing to her. Meanwhile, Carl visits Frank's father, who openly refuses to give up his son. However, Carl finds a letter from Frank with an address in Atlanta. The address leads Carl and his team to Frank's house, but Frank has already gone to Louisiana to see Brenda's parents. Carl notices that Frank's Harvard diploma bears Frank's new alias, and he leads him to the hospital where Frank has already left. Frank and Brenda meet with their parents in Louisiana, where Frank claims to be not only Lutheran like themselves, but also a qualified attorney and doctor. Brenda's father, Roger, questions Frank about his feelings, leading Frank to openly admit that he's neither a lawyer, nor a doctor, nor a co-pilot. But Roger believes that's just considering it a romantic speech. He agrees to give it to his daughter as a gift. Frank also passes the bar exam and joins Roger's law firm as an assistant district attorney. As the wedding preparations continue, Frank returns to New York to visit his father and tell him about the engagement. Frank S.R., now a U.S. Postal Service employee and still battling the IRS, reveals to her son that his mother has married Jack Burns and moved out for good, leaving Frank devastated. He also reveals that he has had a visit from the FBI and knows what Frank is doing, and Frank desperately pleads with his father to stop. But Frank S.R. encourages him to continue instead. Frustrated that his father can't act like his father, Frank says goodbye to Frank S.R. On Christmas Eve, Carl calls the waiting FBI office and asks his team to listen. Frank says he's done and calmed down and asks Carl to stop chasing him. Carl informs him that this is not possible as Frank stole about $4 million at the time. Frank understands and hangs up, but he doesn't realize that he made a mistake in telling Carl about his engagement. Carl, who previously found Frank's alias in Atlanta, speculated that when Frank moved to Louisiana he had to keep the same name because he was dating a girl who believed it was his real name. After confirming the wedding announcement, Carl and his men successfully track down Frank on the night of the engagement party, and Frank confesses to Brenda who he really is before escaping through a window, revealing that he is a local. I asked him to meet me at the airport a few days later. However, when she arrives as planned, Frank is devastated to see Brenda being closely watched by a series of FBI agents in disguise, which Frank takes lightly. When Frank doesn't show up, Carl has his men stake out the airport, convinced that Frank will try to track him down somehow, and tries to escape by plane rather than leaving town in a more sober way. Frank enacts a new plan to pose as a recruiting pilot for Pan Am Airlines and attend a local university to recruit stewardesses for a trip to Europe. He hosts auditions, picks the hottest girls he can find, and dresses them up in uniforms. He then goes to the airport, where he makes his way through the crowd, using the girl as eye candy and completely distracting the agents from looking at him. Frank manages to escape past Carl's men to Europe. He also uses decoys in the unloading zone to further confuse Carl. 7 months later, in 1967, Carl tells his boss that Frank is forging checks all over the Eastern Hemisphere, except this time, the check is real. Frank claims to be completely out of control and asks permission to track him down in Europe. However, his boss refuses his permission, saying that if Carl can't catch Frank while he's in the United States, he can't catch him in Europe. Refusing to give up, Carl takes one of Frank's counterfeit checks to a professional printer. Professional printers assume that the quality of the checks must have been printed by a particular printer. This printer is only available in a few European countries, one of which is France. From an interview with Frank's mother, she recalls being born in France. Carl travels to her hometown of Montrechard and finds Frank at a giant printing factory that prints thousands of checks on Christmas Eve. Carl tells Frank that he has promised to come with the French police and arrest them himself. Frank assumes Carl is lying, but Carl convinces him that he will be shot if he leaves the factory without Carl. Frank agrees to handcuff himself and Carl takes him outside, seeing the police are away, and praises Carl for his ability to trick him. However, the French police arrive almost immediately and he escorts Frank to prison while Carl promises to extradite Frank to the United States. 2 years later, Frank is released from Carl's custody, and on Christmas Eve 1969, a plane to deliver Frank flies to the United States. As they prepare to land, Carl informs Frank that Frank S.R. accidentally died the previous year. A devastated Frank locks himself in the plane's bathroom and escapes from the plane to find out where his mother lies. His escape brings them to the Burns mansion, where Frank found his mother and happily married his second husband. Realizing his father died and his mother moved out, Frank quietly surrenders when Carl and the local police arrive and arrest him. In front, Frank was eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to 12 years in full isolation at the highest security Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Over the next 4 years, Frank receives regular visits from Carl, especially around Christmas time. During one of these visits, Frank easily identifies the counterfeiter Carl as targeting by simply glancing at the check Carl nonchalantly shows him, giving an FBI agent an idea. Some time later, Carl visits Frank again, this time with his boss. They hand him the check. As soon as he touches the check, he properly identifies it as fake, making Carl smile. In 1974, Carl allowed Frank to serve the remainder of his sentence by working in the FBI's fraud checking unit under Carl's supervision. Despite being released from his prison, Frank is tied to a desk job and misses the thrill of his old life. When he finds a pilot's uniform, Frank wants to pretend to be an airline pilot again. Carl met him at the airport just as he was about to fly off. Carl releases him and predicts that Frank will return to his job on Monday as no one is following him. Carl returns to the office Monday morning and is nervous that Frank won't show up for work on time. However, Frank shows up and the two pass a recently discovered forgery check, revealing a new method of forgery never encountered before. When they see the check, Carl asks Frank what has bothered him for years. He cheated on the Louisiana bar exam and became a lawyer. Frank claims he didn't cheat, studied for 2 weeks, and passed the exam on his own. Carl asks if this is true, but Frank prefers to focus on the case at hand and move on. Scroll through the text and you'll see that Frank has been happily married for 26 years, has 3 sons, lives with his family in the Midwest, is still on good terms with Carl, and has the world's most beautiful son. It becomes clear that they catch an elusive counterfeiter and make millions of dollars every year for his work in conducting anti-counterfeiting checks.